Thumbs up. Good afternoon and welcome. Thank you for joining us this afternoon as we are about to have a lunch and learn on the State Budget 101. We have two presenters with us this afternoon, Lauren Piercy and Mandy Pellegrin with the Sycamore Institute. And I'm going to transfer this over to Lauren and she'll do some further introductions and overview over today's presentation. Thank you. If you have, as a reminder, if you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat box and we will get to your questions. Thank you. Go ahead,
Thanks,
Lauren.
Kat. Thanks, Kat. Hey, everyone. I'm Lauren Piercy. I'm the Public Policy Director with the Council on Developmental Disabilities. And every year we look through the state budget and highlight the impact to disability programs. So at the end of today's webinar, I will go through that document and make sure you all know where to find it. But this year, the budget is just a little bit different because there is so much federal funding coming into Tennessee. And because of the recent pandemic, there have been a lot of iterations of the budget and different protections. So we've invited my colleague, Mandy Pellegrin, who is the policy director. Sometimes she also wears the budget director hat over at the Sycamore Institute, which is Tennessee's nonpartisan think tank and research center. They do all sorts of policy issues, but today we're going to be talking specifically about the state budget, doing kind of a 101. So Mandy, I will turn it over to you and please ask questions and use the chat. Mandy will talk till about 12:30 and then I will talk and then we'll have some open time for questions after that as well. Take it away, Mandy.
Thanks so much for having me. So like Lauren said, I am Mandy Pellegrin with the Sycamore Institute, and the Sycamore Institute is an independent, nonpartisan public policy research center for Tennessee. And kind of the thing that makes us unique is our people are bipartisan. So we kind of represent the full spectrum of views personally. But our research is nonpartisan. So we don't take positions or advocate. We try to stick to the facts. We try to keep it objective to the extent that human beings can be objective and give folks the tools that they need to make data and evidence informed decisions about state policy. So today I am here to talk to you about Tennessee's state budget. I have been working on state budget since I started at the Sycamore Institute about 5 years ago. Our very first piece of research that we ever put out was a state budget primer. I have a copy of it right here beside me. It's always beside me. I still reference it, even though I wrote it. And it's probably one of our most used tools that we've ever put out, because if you care about public policy, you got to care about the budget, because that's really where policymakers' priorities are. And it's actually the only thing that the state legislature has to do each year is pass a budget. So I'm going to try to fit everything I know about the budget into the next 25 minutes. And feel free to stop me if you have any questions. So let's see if I can get my slides to advance. So the things I'm going to talk about today, first, I'm going to start with some themes. So these are kind of big ideas that guide the budget process and the spending of money in the budget that are just sort of good to know when following the state budget. Then I'll cover some very high points of the budget process. And finally, we'll end with a quick overview of what the budget pays for and how it's funded, and a few data points on the current budget situation. So first up is, well, like I said, we go into a lot more detail in Sycamore's budget primer, which is on our website, sycamoreinstitutetn.org, and you can navigate to it from kind of the top menu bar, but there you can go through a really detailed explanation of the budget process. So how the budget is decided, an overview of what's in the budget, how things are paid for, how things are spent. deeper dives on some specific issues, historical context, so how things have changed over time, national context, how we compare to other states in spending and taxes and processes and things like that. And we also go through some best practices for state budgeting. And again, that's available for free on the website. It's a PDF document. It's about 50 pages long, so it is definitely a reference material, not necessarily a page turner. So first, let's talk about the themes in the budget. Really, we view the state budget as having three big themes that drive the process and the decisions. First, and probably most importantly to know, is that we have a balanced budget requirement in our state constitution. So it requires that the state spend no more money in a given year than it brings in or has on hand in that year. So it is sort of like a real-time balanced budget requirement. It doesn't mean that the budget that gets passed has to be balanced. It means that at the end of the fiscal year, everything had to balance. The balanced budget requirement means that the state budget is one, dynamic and often changing, and two, full of trade-offs. So you have to keep revenues in balance with expenditures, in real time as the spending and the revenues are coming in within the midst of a fiscal year. So last year, for example, is a really great example of how things had to be dynamic and changing in the middle of a fiscal year, because we were hit with a pandemic that basically shut businesses down and made everyone stay at home. So tax dollars took a nosedive. And so a lot of decisions had to be made in the midst of the fiscal year to make sure that the budget was balanced at the end of the fiscal year. And then in terms of trade-offs, every dollar spent on one thing is a dollar that can't be spent somewhere else or given back to the taxpayer. So it means that the budget is full of trade-offs, trading off one thing for another thing. The budget is also full of limitations. So these limitations can drive how much or how little can be spent and in what ways the money can be spent. Sometimes we have specific revenue sources that dictate the limitations. For example, federal dollars or state taxes may be earmarked for specific purposes. Some programs might have matching requirements or entitlement obligations like TennCare that dictate how state dollars are spent. And the reason that I start off with this, and it's important for advocates to know, is because sometimes these things can feel very frustrating and challenging when you go to advocate for the things that that you want and that you think are important and that are priorities in your lives. But these are some of the challenges that policymakers do have to deal with as they make budget decisions. So I think it's important that, to effectively advocate, you sort of know what the challenges are for the policymakers that you'll be talking to. So next, I'm going to go just a little bit into the budget process. I am not going to go deeply into it. We have about half of the budget primer is probably dedicated to explaining the budget process. But I really want to talk about some of the high-level nuts and bolts of how policymakers write and manage the budget. So at any given time in the year, there are at least 3 fiscal years of action. So fiscal years are the budget year. It's not a calendar year. It is 12 months, and I'll talk about when it starts and ends here in a second. But so right now, we are in the middle of fiscal year 2021. We're actually towards the end of it. And they are executing the fiscal year 2021 budget. They just got done formulating the fiscal year 2022 budget. And then we have auditors and folks like that are still auditing and reconciling past year's budget. So fiscal year 2020 and maybe even before that. So I have a graphic up on the screen that represents Tennessee's budget cycle. On it, we have 2 concentric circles that represent 2 fiscal years. The inside circle represents the current fiscal year, and it's labeled budget execution, which basically just means spending the money. And then the outermost circle is the upcoming fiscal year. So the budget that gets formulated and passed by the governor and the General Assembly. The state fiscal year begins on July 1st, which is that star that's on the outermost circle all the way to the right, and it ends in June. So obviously this is different than our calendar year. It's also different than the federal fiscal year, which starts in October and ends in September. So right now we are in the fourth quarter of fiscal year 2021. The governor and state lawmakers just recently passed the budget for fiscal year 2022, which will begin on July 1st. And then not long after, the administration will start planning for fiscal year 2023, which begins on July 1st of 2022. So is that enough 2020s to get you a little bit confused? So again, a lot more detail in the budget primer, but I'm going to hit on a few key features of the process that might provide some important context for thinking about the programs that you care about within the state budget. So the first concept is called the recurring base budget. So this is the starting point for each year's budget. This is what the governor is starting with, and he begins to formulate his recommendation. So the budget distinguishes between recurring items and non-recurring items. Recurring items are expected to happen again and again, and non-recurring ones are one time, although sometimes non-recurring items are funded year after year. But both expenditures and revenues get these categorizations as recurring or non-recurring. And the reason that we do that is distinguishing between the two helps keep the budget balanced over the longer term. So when the executive branch begins planning for the next year's budget, they begin with those recurring items and they add or take away to the recurring base budget. Another important thing to know is that a lot of the things in the base recurring budget have strings attached to them. So maybe requirements or limitations. So the basic education program, that's the formula that funds our local schools. It's a great example. A lot of funding for education is driven by a formula that is driven by the number of students we expect to have in the state. So there's not a lot of wiggle room, and that's a big part of the state budget. Another good example is TennCare. So it's essentially an entitlement. And that means that so together, when you have all these things in your base budget, your starting point that have strings attached to them, that means that there's really only a small portion of the budget that has much flexibility in terms of scaling up or down. A second important thing to know about the process is revenue estimation. So this is estimating how much money you think you're going to have to spend as a state. When you are operating in a balanced budget environment, all the decisions about spending that you're making are done within the limits of an estimate of how much revenue there will be. So in recent years, the state's revenue estimates have been more on the conservative side, which means there's often a lot of money that's sort of left over at the end of the fiscal year that wasn't budgeted. And sometimes we call these surpluses, and I'll talk a little bit more about these later, but you probably heard about them in the news as well. Obviously, in a balanced budget situation, it is much better to underestimate your revenues than it is to overestimate your revenues. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. The next important piece of the process is the appropriations bill. So this is the budget that actually gets passed by the legislature. So the governor will present his budget each year in February, and that kicks off the legislative approval process. So I talked about how the governor's starting point is the recurring base budget. Well, the legislature's starting point is the appropriations bill, which reflects the governor's recommendation. So the General Assembly will usually make some changes to the bill, but in recent years, those have not been significant. This year was a little bit different, mostly because there really isn't much wiggle room within the budget proposal for the legislature. The budget has to stay balanced. So if the legislature wants to add something, then it would have to take something that the governor had in there away or raise taxes or something like that. So in recent years, the governor's budget has really only included pretty small set-asides for legislative priorities, maybe $10 to $20 million in, a tens of billions of dollar budget. So legislative changes in recent years have focused mainly on funding for pet projects or making small additions or subtractions from the governor's proposal. And I say this to kind of give you an idea of where an advocate's time might be best spent if you're trying to influence the budget. The final piece that I'll talk about here in the process is budget management. So once a budget is passed, The executive branch has a tremendous amount of flexibility to manage the budget within the amounts that are appropriated by the legislature. So this means that while you might see a spending number in the budget or the appropriations bill, that number is actually pretty dynamic even after the budget has passed. Why is that? Back to the balanced budget requirement. Throughout the year, folks are monitoring those revenue collections. So how the taxes are coming in, how much money the state actually has to spend relative to the tax projections. Well, if those revenues come in below the projections, then there's a risk of facing a deficit, which would literally violate our state constitution for having a balanced budget. So the executive branch has to have a considerable amount of flexibility to stay within the resources available to keep the budget balanced. Okay, so that's all I'm going to cover on the process for now, but we can cover any questions later if you have them. Now, I'm going to just give you some basics on where the money comes from and where it goes. So in fiscal year 2020, which was the one that ended last June, the state spent a little over $38 billion, and about half of that money came from state revenues, so the state's own dollars, but the federal government pitched in 37%, and that's actually a pretty big role for the state budget. So on the other side, our two biggest categories of spending were health and social services and education, which together make up about 3/4 of the budget, and everything else is scattered across all the other programs: transportation, economic development, corrections, criminal justice, all those things. Health and social services is 3/4. So now zooming in on just that state revenues piece, so the state appropriations, the money that is the state's money and where it comes from, the biggest slice, of course, is from our general sales tax, generally around about 54–55% of all the state dollars in the budget come from the general sales tax. The rest comes from selective sales taxes, which are things like a tobacco tax or an alcohol tax. Franchise and excise tax is a big one. That is corporate tax, so taxes on businesses. Then we have all our gas, fuel, and motor vehicle taxes, which mostly go towards transportation spending. We have a teeny tiny sliver for individual income tax in 2020, but that tax actually went away in January 2021, so you won't see that on future pie charts. And then everything else is in that last 15%. So what does our tax structure look like compared to other states? The Tennessee data here are pretty much the same as the previous slide. There are some small differences just because I'm using a different data source. Now, here's Tennessee. Here's what all 50 states together look like. So it's a pretty different spread, and I'm going to describe how it's different here in a second. So from the visual, I'm eliminating all the categories that are similar. And what is left is that Tennessee is much more reliant on general sales tax and corporate taxes than other states are, and much less reliant on individual income tax. The point here is that our tax structure is pretty different. And the reason that's important is because each kind of tax has trade-offs. So sometimes when we care about issues, we think more about the spending side, but the revenue side is also important. Each of these types of taxes affects citizens in different ways and creates different kinds of incentives that can influence other things in a state. It influences our spending power. If we have completely eliminated one major source of funding, for example, an individual income tax, it means that we have much less flexibility on other types of revenue sources. So that's kind of the point of the tax discussion. So no matter the tax, projecting them, so predicting what they're going to do into the future and doing it accurately is really, really hard. And the end result is either a deficit, which I talked about is not allowed under the state constitution, or a surplus, so money left over at the end of the fiscal year. In recent years, like I said, Tennessee's revenue projections have tended to be on the conservative side, so erring towards larger underestimations. And the reason that's important is because if you overestimate and you're facing a deficit, you have to cut spending in the middle of the fiscal year. And that is very difficult to do, to tell programs that, oh, remember that money we gave you? We're going to have to pull that back. So that presents very difficult decisions. So most states would prefer to have underestimations. So what has been going on over the last year is actually a pretty pronounced instance of the difficulty of projecting revenues accurately. So looking at the current state of tax collections and projections in Tennessee, when the pandemic, so you see a graph here that shows actual collections of state taxes in 2018 and 2019, and it's an upward trajectory, which when the economy is good, we usually see tax collections going up. So when the pandemic hit at the end of fiscal year 2020, lawmakers actually revised their projections, and they estimated that our tax collections would basically remain flat into 2020, and then they would fall into 2021. So we would actually have less money than we did the year before. As it turns out, revenues actually grew a little bit in fiscal year 2020. So the governor's budget for fiscal year 2022, so the one that's coming up, revised estimates to anticipate that we actually would have some growth into 2021 and 2022. So all of this difference between kind of what we thought we were going to get and what we now think we're going to get, all this difference between these two lines, that is what makes a surplus. In reality, the trajectory for fiscal year 2021, the current fiscal year, tax collections are actually way higher than even the revised projections. So our economy is doing good. The consumer spending is way up, likely because of all the federal stimulus money that has gone out. And so basically what that means is we're going to end up with a very large end of year balance or surplus. And this graph shows you sort of what those end of year surpluses have looked like over the last 7 or 8 years. So usually they are in, actually there's no usual amount, before 2021, it ranges from a low of about $150 million at the end of 2015 to a high of a little over $1 billion in 2017. Well, right now we are on track to have an end of year balance of $2.2 billion. So that is a very large end of year surplus. And here's how those balances work when you think about spending. So the surplus is treated as a non-recurring revenue source for the first year. So a surplus is often used to invest in one-time things. So think like capital projects, building improvements, economic development incentives that the state may give to companies to move to Tennessee. So that is how a surplus happens, and that is how a surplus is usually used. And I know that a lot of discussion on surpluses have been in the news if they're talking about kind of a high-level overview of the budget in Tennessee. The next revenue source that I want to talk about is federal funding. So here we have a graph of the state budget's reliance on federal funding over time, and it shows the dollar amount on the bars, and the line is the percentage of the total budget that comes from federal dollars. So the total dollar amount has grown a lot over time, mostly just because of inflation. So don't pay too much attention to that. But this goes through fiscal year 2020. And what you see here is that traditionally federal dollars had made up between 30 and 35% of the state's budget. So about a third. The Great Recession hit in 2007. The Recovery Act was passed. There was a huge infusion of federal dollars into state budgets across the country. And so our reliance on federal dollars sort of peaked during that time, around 40%. As of fiscal year 2020, we were at more like 37%. And that's probably going to go up quite a bit over the next few years as all of the additional money that Congress is sending our way starts to get here and starts to get spent. So basically strap in to see this number kind of come up. Now, in terms of dependence on federal funding, we are one of the more dependent states on federal funding as a percentage of our total state budget. And I'll talk a little bit more about why that's important in a second. So what we see here is a graph that shows the amount of money of new federal dollars that have been passed since the beginning of the pandemic by the US Congress. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different funding packages. Altogether, they total $5.2 trillion in federal aid to governments, businesses, individuals. For context, the big 2009 stimulus bill that I just talked about during the Great Recession totaled just over $800 billion. So Recovery Act pales in comparison to the kind of money that we were talking about during the pandemic. And this federal money is probably why the state didn't see its own revenue losses that just about everyone expected last summer. And it's also why federal dollars will probably account for a larger share of the total state budget for at least the next few years. And the reason that's important is because there are a lot of strings attached to the federal budget, to federal funding. First, you have limits on purpose. So we can't just use the money that the federal government sends us for whatever we want. It's awarded for specific purposes, and we have to use it in specific ways. Two, federal dollars usually have limits on what the state can do with its own money. So a lot of the federal dollars come with matching requirements, for example. So by accepting the federal funds for a particular program, the state is often tying up its own revenue at the same time for that same purpose. And then finally, some federal dollars come with limits on non-budgetary policy. So sometimes federal money is predicated on the state having specific policies in place. So a good example is federal highway funds. There are actually a lot of strings attached to federal highway funds. Our DUI laws have to look a specific way. Part of the funding is predicated on us having a drinking age that's 21 instead of 18. So all the different kinds of dollars in the budget matter. So looking at the pie chart, you can't just say, well, we have $38 billion. Why can't we spend it in this, all these ways that would be really great? It's because there's a lot of different limitations associated with the different kinds of dollars. So now that we know the different kinds of dollars, let's look at how the state funds different kinds of programs. So this shows what the state government pays for and how. So different program areas are listed across the bottom, and this is a bar chart. The program areas are health and social services, education, transportation and economic development, and so on. And they get smaller as they go down. And we're just going to focus on health and social services and education. And then it's color coded. The height represents how much money was spent on that area. And then the blocks within the height, so the colors, represent where that money is coming from. So green on the bottom is state dollars, maroon in the middle is federal dollars, and then the blue on top is other, which includes things like tuition. So the largest expenditure is health and social services, and that was $17 billion in fiscal year 2020. But that is primarily paid for with federal dollars. So 63% of health and social services spending in Tennessee is funded with federal dollars. The next biggest expenditure category is education, and that was $11 billion, but the state pays for most of that. And these distinctions are important because the way that different kinds of programs are funded can affect the level of power that state policymakers have over both programmatic and funding decisions. So this is sort of a macro view of what you would be considering at a very micro level, or what Lauren has to consider at a micro level. So different funding sources matter. This shows the different kinds of dollars in the state budget and how they are spent in different ways. So we have three pie charts on the screen. One shows how all revenues together are spent, which was the same as the pie chart earlier. Then we have how just the state dollars are spent. And then we have how just the federal dollars are spent. So when we look at the overall state budget, the largest spending category is health and social services. But when you look at just state dollars in the middle chart, the largest category by far is education. And then to the right is federal dollars, and those are overwhelmingly spent on health and social services. And in fact, TennCare and SNAP alone account for 3/4 of all the federal dollars in Tennessee's state budget. So I'm coming up on my time limit here, but one important and timely thing to know is what happens to a state budget that has to balance when a recession hits. So typically, recessions will cause tax revenues to plummet, and often the need for state programs will increase. So that means that the state has to make quick decisions to keep things balanced, finding places to cut mid-year, finding new sources of revenue, crossing its fingers that the federal government will help them out. And one of the tools in the toolbox is the state's rainy day fund. So this shows the balance of the official rainy day fund and the 10-care reserve since before the Great Recession through the end of next year, fiscal year 2022. So we are on track for a total of $2.1 billion in the rainy day fund, which is the largest balance ever. But in terms of spending power to keep the lights on, which is the pink line, we're about where we were going into the Great Recession. So lots more money, but the spending power is about the same as it was going into the Great Recession. So the recession that we just experienced, I don't think it has officially been declared over by economists, but more than likely it was a relatively short recession. While the last recession was long, its effects were felt for many, many years. So having a very large rainy day fund was really important to get the state through that recession. One really important thing to know about that rainy day fund, however, is for Tennessee, by statute, it is an avenue of last resort. So the governor can't just tap it if some program they like goes over budget. It's reserved specifically for when revenues fall. And it also says that policymakers need to tap other things first. Of course, that's subjective, but when we thought the pandemic was going to hit revenues really hard, the governor and lawmakers planned for spending cuts first. And then they were going to sweep other reserve accounts and balances across state governments. So lots of programs have their own kind of reserve accounts or savings accounts. And there was actually no plan to use dollars from the rainy day fund in the short term, just in case the pandemic caused a long-term recession or had long-term economic fallout like the Great Recession did. That's kind of to give you context for some stuff you may have seen on the news. I don't know. There were a lot of things, people talking about using the rainy day fund. If there was ever a time to use the rainy day fund, it would be now, but this gives you a little bit of context for how those decisions were getting made and how they would get made in the future. The last thing I'm going to show you is putting some of these things in a national context. I'm going to show you how Tennessee ranks nationally on various measures of revenues and spending. So the full graphic is in the budget primer. So you don't try to read every little line that's on this slide. It's a little bit small. Just know that taxes are at the top and spending is at the bottom. So at the top, we have things like total state tax bill per person, sales tax rate, totals. And then at the bottom, we have things like total state spending per person and so on. So if the line goes all the way to the right, we rank high. And if it's all the way to the left, we rank low. So how does Tennessee compare to other states? So here we have total spending per person and total spending on lots of other things. And what you see is that our spending is relatively low compared to other states. We are the 12th lowest overall in terms of spending per person, and we're even lower on some specific categories like transportation spending per person, 10-care spending per enrollee. Since the budget has to balance, it's no surprise that our overall tax burden, which is the little bubble at the very top, is also fairly low. We have the 8th lowest state taxes per person in the country. As we discussed earlier, since we have no income tax, which is the second bubble from the top, we're more dependent on other sources of revenue. So our overall tax burden is low. We have no income tax, so that's obviously low compared to other states, but it means that all of our other revenue sources are actually quite high compared to other states. So we have one of the highest sales tax rates in the country, one of the highest grocery tax rates, highest gas taxes, things like that, more reliance on federal funding. So that means that if we wanted to scale up spending in places, our options are pretty limited because we're already pretty high on a lot of revenue measures. So that is a really zoomed out view of the state budget and kind of the ins and the outs and how they work and the limitations. And it is not by any means meant to frustrate you or deter you from doing your jobs. and using your voice. It's just so that you can go into the work that you do a little bit more informed. And on this last screen, and Lauren can share it later, I'm sure, is our website address where all of the work that we do on the budget is published. The budget primer is there. We also do a summary of the budget every year and how it changes throughout the legislative process. And we also just have lots of other research that you might find interesting about state policy. And my email address is also there if you have any questions for me specifically. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and I'll just drop that information in the chat.
That'll be perfect. Thank you, Mandy. And thanks everyone who's joined. We kicked off right at 12 because we're recording this webinar and we will have it posted so you can catch up on what you missed. It was just introductions really. Kat, do you want to say anything to the group? Okay, I'm gonna grab my slide deck. It is a deeper dive into how disability programs have been impacted by this year's budget. Does anyone have questions for Mandy before I dive in? And please use the chat. You don't have to hold your questions. Seeing none, I'm going to plow on. So here I am. Most of you know me. I'm the public policy director, and I gave this context at the beginning. Every year we try to review the state budget and learn how much money did key disability programs receive. So if we missed a program you care about, let us know. We have actually added programs every year because of feedback. So please, we welcome that. So the first few programs I'm going to go over are programs that had no budget changes compared to last year. So that includes us, the Council on Developmental Disabilities. We are mostly federally funded, but we do get a very small, relatively speaking, state appropriation. It's about $200,000 every year. And we typically don't request changes or get changes. So we have 10 staff total for our statewide program, and our total budget is about $2 million. Most of that, again, is federal funding. One of our very comparable, we call them sister state agencies, that's considered more of a board or a commission compared to the cabinet level agencies, is the Commission on Aging and Disability. You may know them as TCAD. And in your areas, there are area agencies on aging and disability, and they get their money passed through from the Commission on Aging and Disability. Their state funding is about $16 million, and they, like us, had no changes in state funding. They have about 31 staff, and their total budget is $50 million. Like us, they get a lot of federal funding from the Older Americans Act in their case. And for them, they did get increases from federal dollars, but just not from state dollars this year. Also, the Department of Treasury was no changes in funding. The reason we mention them is because they have the very important Able Tennessee Savings Program for people with disabilities, and there were no changes to that program compared to last year. Now, the exciting part, the programs with increases in state funding. So the Commission on Children and Youth is a lot like the Commission on Aging. It's like us, the Council on Developmental Disabilities, where it has a specific focus, them being on children and youth. And their state funding is about $3 million, which is an increase, relatively small, $30,000 compared to last year. Like TCAD, they have about 30 staff, and their total budget is $5.7 million. So they're, comparatively speaking, get more state funding than federal funding. The Department of Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities, which many of us know as DIDD, state funding is about $50 million, and they provide direct services, as you all know. That's about an increase of $1 million. So relatively speaking, pretty small. Their budget does include new funding for an increase in the hourly wage for direct support professionals. There are also other exciting new initiatives that when you have a copy of the PowerPoint, you can go to the hyperlink here and go directly to DIDD's summary. And we're trying to keep this really small and really simple, but DIDD does a great job of being very transparent with all of their budget initiatives, and so they do a great summary every year. They have about 1,700 staff across the state, and their total budget is $245 million. So they get a lot of federal funding. Some of their funding comes from TennCare, and so we'll go into that a little bit later. The Department of Health, which has a lot of impact, of course, for people with disabilities, especially during the pandemic, had an increase of about $4 million. Their state budget is about $225 million from state funding. The increase for the program we work most closely with, which is the Family Health and Wellness Division, and they provide children's special services for children who have special health care needs and no other insurance options, did get an increase. Their total budget is about $17 million. And the Department of Health as a whole has about 3,000 staff. That's one of the largest state agency staff, and a total budget of about $685 million. Labor and Workforce Development also has a lot of programs that can serve people with disabilities. Their workforce services serve everyone, especially people with barriers to work, which include people with disabilities. They have about $50 million in state funding. They did get an increase. And a program highlight I wanted to mention for this group is that they launched during COVID a virtual American Job Center. So traditionally, you have to go to a physical site in your community called an American Job Center to get help with resumes, job searching, all sorts of wraparound services if you need transportation or childcare. Now you can do that all online. So that's a big impact to people with disabilities and really all Tennesseans. And they have about 1,200 staff across the state and a total budget of $210 million. Mental health and substance abuse services, which many of you know, people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, many people with developmental disabilities have a co-occurring mental health condition. I think the national average is about 40%. So these programs are really important to our community, excuse me, our community. The state funding is about $325 million, which is an increase of about $28 million compared to last year. That's a big investment in by our state in a State Department. And so program highlights for the disability community include an increase for mobile crisis services and an increase for the behavioral health safety net. This is a program for people who are uninsured to still be able to access mental health services. So if you don't know about this program, look it up. They've expanded to cover children who are uninsured. And it's a really important program for people who otherwise would have a barrier to receiving mental health services because they would have no insurance. The Department of Mental Health and Substance Abuse Services has about 1,800 staff across the state and a total budget of about $468 million. So you can see that the state portion of that is pretty significant. The division of TennCare is about $4 billion, as Mandy mentioned, one of the biggest state funded sources, state funding recipients in our whole state government. That's an increase of about $135 million, which in most cases would be a huge state investment and increase, but it's all relative when you're talking in the billions of dollars. They have about 1,200 staff across the state, and their total budget is about $13 billion when you count the federal funding. So a couple of highlights here for us to be aware of is about $330 million goes toward DIDD's overall budget, and about $11 million went to 300 more slots for the Employment and Community First Choices program. These new slots, just to kind of manage expectations here, are already prioritized for people who have aging caregivers, are transitioning from state custody, that means children in foster care, or are otherwise in some sort of crisis. So the slots are essentially spoken for. So the new slots or the more slots is something to, there's some context around that. So seeing nothing in the chat, I'm going to plow on. I hope folks have questions at the end. There's a couple of programs that have an overall increase to the department and then just no change for disability programs that I wanted to highlight. So at the Department of Human Services, for the entire department, state funding is about $186 million, and they did get an overall increase of about $40 million compared to last fiscal year. Now that department does a very wide range of things, from the TANF program that Mandy mentioned, which is a huge budget item, to all sorts of other programs, childcare, you name it. And the program that I wanted to call attention to was the vocational rehabilitation program, which is within Rehabilitation Services Division. And funding did not change for that program. It's about $17 million a year. And that department has, I think, the most staff of any state agency, 4,000 staff across the state, and a total budget of $2.8 billion when you factor in federal funding. Kind of similarly, the Department of Education, which has a huge state investment of $5.6 billion and reflected an increase of about $341 million compared to last fiscal year, did not change funding for special education services compared to last year. That funding is about $1 million. And it's important to note that funds that go to school districts go through that formula that Mandy mentioned, the BEP formula, and they're distributed through federal funds and state funds that go through that formula based on the number of students with disabilities in districts. So that $1 million is pretty much the state level investment in staff and the whole team of special education professionals that work at the State Department. An additional $35 million in state funds goes to the state special schools. Those are the school for the deaf, the school for the blind. There's about 4 or 5 across the state. And the Department of Education has about 1,100 staff and a total budget of almost that should be a B, billion dollars. I'll have to fix that. So a very big proportion of the education funds come from the state government. And Governor Lee has mentioned that it's a huge priority for him. So very briefly, and then I'll be finished, other state highlights. One of the governor's initiatives was to establish a $250 million mental health trust fund for K-12 education. It's not clear yet exactly what that funding will go toward, but that will be a set aside protected amount of money that can be invested in helping students with mental health resources and services. Another thing that happened just this past year is that the Department of Human Resources included investment of $265,000, more or less, for implementing what is called the State as a Model Employer Initiative. And this means recruiting and retaining employees with disabilities. So presumably that investment is for a couple of staff to manage that program, and will be involved in the implementation of that program. The Department of Environment and Conservation, which is in charge of parks and all sorts of state parks, included $30 million for making state parks more accessible. And so we have the press release that wasn't included in the appropriations bill as a line item I can point to, but we have the press release that showed that, and we have been talking to the Department of Environment and Conservation about some ideas for making parks more accessible, including one of our key initiatives, which is thinking about adult-sized changing tables as part of accessibility. And finally, the Department of Transportation, many of you know, launched a new Office of Accessible Transportation last year. We are the first state to do anything like this at the state level. And this did not require additional state appropriations, but I still wanted to mention it as a key development for the disability community. So here are the sources. We went through the final budget bill, which is, as Mandy said, the appropriations bill is the final say on where the state budget lands. But the governor's budget really sets the tone, and like Mandy says, has a lot of influence. It's pretty much the exact same as the appropriations bill. So we looked at both of those, and then the press release I mentioned, and we did get confirmation from all of the state agencies referenced just to make sure we weren't missing something. So you can look for this kind of summary in a Word document, not a PowerPoint like this. Every year, if you subscribe to our policy newsletter, and also this year, a link to the summary, a link to this webinar, and this PowerPoint, once I fix that typo, will be on our state policy webpage. So you can share it from there or go back and look at it from there. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing and hope that there are some questions or comments before we let you go.
Okay, Lauren, I'm not seeing any in the chat box, so that means you guys just did a fabulous job of explaining everything. A lot of good information, complex information, and trying to understand the state budget and all the different categories and what goes where. So Sarah Scott writes that your newsletter is great and that she shares it frequently. So great. And we've got a comment. Thank you. Lots of great information. Great information. This helps me understand. So see there, you guys were just awesome in explaining things. Wonderful. And it's my understanding, Lauren and Mandy, that this session is going to be posted on our websites and yours at the Sycamore Institute too, for those that were not able to tune in today. So that will be available. So you can take your time and review it again if you'd like, just to maybe help digest the information a little bit better. Also, there will be a survey that will be sent out afterwards to our participants for today. Your feedback is very important to us. It helps us as we continue to do the work that we do. Also, if there are any suggestions for future topics for our Lunch and Learn webinars, please feel free to share those as well, as we want to cater to things that are important to you. So Mandy and Lauren, any last comments before we are gone for the day?
I don't think so. If you guys think of more questions, let us know. You can reach either of us. And thanks for joining us today and logging in.
Okay, I see Gloria has her hand up. Gloria, did you have a question?
No, I just wanted to applaud you all.
Well, thank you. We appreciate you joining us today.
Thank you, Gloria. So good to hear from you.
All right. Well, thank you all. Thank you, Mandy, for your time. Thank you, Lauren, again, for your time. It's always a pleasure. And we will see you all soon. Thank you. Have a great afternoon.